Good afternoon, everybody. It is Friday, October 30th. Happy early Halloween. We are in the midst of the 2020 general election. I'm Keir Murray. I'm joined by my dad, Dr. Richard Murray from the University of Houston. As all of you know, we've been early voting now for 2.5 weeks or so. Today is the final day of early voting in Texas, and lots of votes happening around the country. And of course, next Tuesday will be the presidential election day. This will be our final installment of these conversations prior to the election. We'll have to see what happens and what we want to do after the fact. But let's take stock of what's going on nationally. Little, it seems to me, has changed in the presidential race. Polling certainly indicates that, the quality polling anyway. There's been some less than high quality polling, and that I think for ulterior motives has probably been injected into the conversation late here to make things seem a little different than they might be. But the quality polling shows a very stable race. And in upwards 80 or more million votes already been cast. Where do you think things sit relative to November 3rd now, just 4 days out?
Well, I think we're past half the total vote. It's going to be much higher at the end than it was in 2016, but it's pretty hard to see getting more than 160 million people vote. That would be up 22 million from 4 years ago. Yeah, a couple of things besides the polling are selected type. Gallup shows that the enthusiasm gap clearly favors Democrats by about 10 or 15 points. That's comparable to Obama's advantage in 2008, which reinforces the idea that there's probably not going to be any surprise coming out of the reversal of the polling. If people are pretty enthusiastic and there's a clear advantage to one candidate, that's likely to hold up on election day. Other thing, to the extent about half the states have registration by party, and we see that Democrats have generally been doing fine in that regard. It's tightened up in Florida and North Carolina, but to the extent we have hard records of partisan voting, that looks consistent with what we've seen in polling.
Uh, yeah, and that's interesting. You bring up the enthusiasm gap, because as recently as a couple of months ago, Republicans seem to hold that advantage over Democrats heading into the election. What do you think explains that shift?
I think the resurgence of the COVID virus and the president's continued inability to really deal with that has depressed Republican interest. I think there's some increasing sense that it's probably not going to be a good election, that the president's flailing out there and trying to address this. Hard to see how these big in-person rallies that get a lot of pub and visibility really help move undecided voters, particularly what looks like to be one of his 2 or 3 Achilles heels, and that is older voters, where he did fine with them in 2016. Doesn't seem to be doing nearly as well in 2020, particularly in Pennsylvania and Florida, the 2 states that have the largest ratio of older voters to total electorate.
Yeah, and I wonder, we've talked about this a little bit before, but I wonder if, the president for several months now has attacked mail ballot voting as being ripe for fraud, has discouraged his supporters from using it, at least at first. He seems to not have talked as much about that recently, but there was some thought that a lot of Republican voters were holding back their votes for election day. We'll get to Texas in a minute, but I see no evidence of that here in Texas so far. But what about this notion that, the president doesn't seem to have changed the conversation, doesn't seem to have reversed the trajectory of the race, now just 72 hours or so away? Is there a turnout risk for his party here at the margins, that if people who would be supportive of him say, well, it looks like he's probably not going to make it, maybe I'll sit this one out? Do you sense that that's a possible risk for him, and more profoundly for down ballot Republicans?
Yeah, I think at the extremes, we have this very tail of the distribution in the Republican conservative direction, where Trump loses the popular vote, but repeats the 2016, more narrowly winning in the electoral college. There's probably a tiny chance of that, maybe I think 5%. But at the other extreme, I think the odds have grown considerably for a Democratic win of landslide proportions. And I'm describing that as 10 points or more in difference between the two major party candidates. That's coming more and more into focus. And again, that's, you're at 6 points, you're still going to lose in the electoral college, but 10 points, you can take a lot of other Republicans down with you. And that's the real significance there.
Yeah, I've noticed in particular some of the polling out of Georgia over the last week or two it shows a shift there away from the Republican Party that's not only affecting the president's numbers there, but two United States Senate races that are on the ballot, one for a special election to fill a remainder of a term, and the other, Senator Perdue being challenged by John Ossoff. That's a state, frankly, that I remain pretty skeptical was really on the table for flipping until about 2 weeks ago. But I mean, unless these numbers are wrong, it increasingly looks like that may be the case. And my guess is Georgia is not alone.
No. When we describe regions that are the critical battlegrounds, we usually say Florida and the upper Midwest. We usually haven't been saying South Atlantic states, but it looks like to me that in fact, that's going to be a critical battleground. Virginia has become safely Democratic, but North Carolina is very much in the mix. South Carolina, surprisingly, again, Graham's still probably favored in the Senate race, but not by any means a lock. But now Georgia may be, facing a Sherman march through by Biden year, where Ossoff is pretty close to winning this deal outright in the most recent polls. Georgia has
Warnock,
the special.
I think Warnock's the one in the multi-candidate field, right?
Yeah, he's a lock to make the runoff because the Republicans are splitting the vote up, and it looks like the small vote for the other Democrats is rallying behind him. But it looks more likely that Ossoff in the regular Senate race could get to the 50% required under Georgia law and avoid a runoff. A runoff's virtually certain, I think, in the other race with so many candidates running, but the Democrat is going to be way ahead. But Georgia looks like perhaps for the Senate now the single most important state. And I think that's why we saw Joe Biden in Warm Springs and, Trump is campaigning there as well. It's suddenly on everybody's radar.
And obviously we're going to shift to Texas momentarily. The last thing I want to address nationally is a sort of slew of lawsuits that are taking place in various states, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and others, about the late delivery and acceptance of mail ballots, things like that. What do you make of this litigation strategy being launched by Republicans as a sort of safety net for them to hang on in some of these cases or in some of these states?
Well, certainly if the national result is in some doubt and flipping one or two states might restore a Republican real shot at the Electoral College, then I think these lawsuits will be pressed very hard. But they won't matter if you get caught in a landslide and you're losing a whole bunch of states. But I think before now in the voting, it's another way to make this case that the Democrats are trying to somehow steal the election. So filing these lawsuits, I think, is designed to try to pump your side up, please the president, who likes to have some resonance out there of his argument that the deals are fixed. But unless an election is really, really close and you have an enormous number of ballots that you're considering, it's not likely to reverse the result because typically, as you know from recounts, nobody gets all the votes there. And so you have to have a pretty close margin to have any real chance of reversing a state tally.
And I've noted that from news media sources as well as other elected officials, and there's now been a sort of pretty public message of discouragement of people attempting to mail their ballots in at this point. They're telling folks either walk it in by hand or take it with you and turn it in at the polling place and vote in person instead, or vote in person if you can. That's pretty remarkable that, that people are being discouraged from using the U.S. Postal Service to cast their vote.
Well, apparently with some good reason. We had reports like in Philadelphia, the usual 2-day delivery of first-class mail was 5 days. Well, we're way within the 5-day window of the election closing down. But in Wisconsin, which initially, had a huge number of requests for mail ballots, the Democrats pivoted a couple of days ago and said, don't mail them, take them in, turn them in, whatever the rule is. In most states, you can bring the ballot request or the ballot in and vote in person, or you can drop it off in a location that goes directly to the counting authority. So yeah, these stories broke far enough out, I think, that it probably prevented a glut of last minute mail ballots, because the Democrats, and I expect the Republicans, are telling everybody too risky to vote by mail now. You got to go in person or else drop it off at a site that will go into the clerk's office or whomever's counting the votes in your jurisdiction.
Yeah, I noted that, this messaging is not coming exclusively from Democrats. I saw some this morning from Republican Party officials. I don't remember, may have been Wisconsin or some state like that, where they were urging voters too late to try to mail your ballot in,
Yeah.
take it in, or go vote in person if you can. Again, I'm just thinking strategically from the president's standpoint. It's like you've created a situation here that ultimately may hurt you yourself, as it, maybe hurts Biden too, but it's puzzling. Not the first among puzzling things I've seen there, but let's shift to Texas. We've been voting, as I said, for about 2.5 weeks now. Today's the final day of early vote. We've seen massive turnout. Yesterday, we surpassed the 9 million vote mark, which thus surpassed our entire 2016 vote. All indications are we're having a robust voting day today. Where do you see things in the state of Texas? What does that large early vote mean for the competitiveness of the state?
I think we're at a very close, tight election. Personally, I think advantage Biden. A lot of other people think advantage Trump. I wouldn't be surprised if Trump wins. I sure wouldn't be surprised if Biden wins. We've got an awful lot of people that don't have much of any vote history, particularly in these big suburban counties. I was just looking at Derek Ryan's tally. He doesn't have, I think, yesterday's vote in, but in these big suburban counties with this huge surge in voting, and that's Collin and Denton and Williamson and Fort Bend and Montgomery, it's like 35% of the people have no vote history. So that's why we're really going to be interested in when we open up those votes in those counties, and that'll happen about 7:30 on election night, and they have an enormous vote that's going to be in. Some of them are at 65% of registration, and that means they're going to have 80% total, but they will probably have close to 70% of their vote already available when we get the report at 7:30, 7:35. And all of us, I think, will really be looking at, okay, this enormous surge in suburban vote. It might be Republican, it might be Democratic, it might be 50-50. But historically, these were counties Republicans counted on to, along with the rural vote, lock up the state. And because they're losing all the big center counties. Even now, I think Tarrant County is going to go Democratic this time around, and losing badly in all the other big four. That's Dallas, Terrace, Travis, and Bear. But if there's no big margin coming out of the suburban counties, there's just not enough rural and small metro vote to offset the huge deficit. Like I think in Harris County, where Trump lost by 170,000, Cruz by 205. I'm looking at Trump losing the county now 350 to 400,000 votes. Wow. That wipes out virtually all of Cruz's margin of victory, which is a little over 200,000 2 years ago.
And so we've had this moving target of turnout in Texas. I think when we were all starting this process, a lot of us thought 10.5 million votes in the state might be a good estimate. Well, we're probably going to be fairly close to 10 million by tonight. Probably won't quite get there, but 9.6, 9.7, something like that is likely. I was looking a little bit at some data this morning. There are still 2 or 3 million regular voters in Texas who have not voted yet. And so we're likely going to have some participation today and a good amount on Tuesday. Where are you pegging overall turnout for the state at this point?
Well, I think Derek Ryan's projection of 12 million that he made 2 weeks ago, is probably now conservative. I think we'll blow past 12 million to 12.5 or so at the final accounting. We do have, different sources of election day voting. There's just some voters across the spectrum that have this history of voting on election day and like it. And some of them are conservative Republicans, but that's also quite common in the Black community. And what we saw, I thought yesterday was pretty clearly around the state, Hispanics were starting to vote in heavier numbers, including here in Harris County. So they've got more room to grow because they have not voted in as high a normal number as everybody else has. So I think the remaining 2.5 to 3 million votes that likely will be cast but aren't yet in will be a little more Latino than what we've seen before. There's some reason Kamala Harris is in, Houston and then going to the Rio Grande Valley, which is up from 216, but not as much as everybody else is up.
Yeah, I mean, my own sense is that, and I've seen this sort of tracking the early vote both here in Harris County and statewide, is that historically the Hispanic vote starts lower and it grows throughout early vote and peaks on election day, and that trend looks to be holding strong this cycle as well. It's actually been moving up quite rapidly over the last couple of days as its overall share of the vote, and I expect that that's going to continue today and Tuesday.
I was just looking at some of the 120 polling stations for early voting in our county, and some of them are in overwhelmingly Hispanic neighborhoods. And they had really pretty puny turnout the first and second week. But yesterday, they were often 2 or 3 times as high as they had been at the front of the week. So, yeah, it looks like the rhythm of our vote is different than in Florida. We famously know in 2016, Hillary Clinton had a pretty big lead in the whatever 7 million votes that had been cast, and it was all lost in the 2.5 million who voted on election day. But that's not the Texas rhythm that we normally see. In our big urban counties, the in-person election day vote tends to be a bit more Democratic than all the votes cast before. And I think what we saw, I thought of the second week here and statewide, a lot of Republican voting. That's when a lot of the Republican base turned out, and their probably best day was about day 7 or 8 of the early vote window, and now not so good as you're coming to the close.
Yeah, my sense is in a county like this one, they're sort of tapping out on their normal pool of supporters, and whether they can grow beyond that this election, we don't know for sure yet. But
the Republican max in our county is about 580,000 votes. That's George W. Bush and Mitt Romney got there. No Republicans ever broken 600,000 in Harris County. That's a problem if you're voting over 1.7 million. I mean, if you top out at 650,000, yeah, that would be a record, but that means the other guys are getting way over 1 million, and you're losing a huge margin in the county.
Yeah. And so what do you think about, we've talked about Biden and Trump, that's a coin flip, maybe who wins the state at this point. Do you think as turnout goes up that benefits one candidate or another for president?
I think it benefits Democrats in this state because the largest amount of potential increase is among Hispanic voters. They're still significantly below their statewide percentage of registered voters. And we've seen in the suburbs, everybody looks like they're voting. And but again, the counties that are at 65%, they can't vote that heavily on election day because they'll be at 70% probably after tonight. And some of the people that are on the registration rolls are no longer in residence. There's some flaws. There are a lot of voters that are on suspense status that are still counted as being registered, but very, very few of them vote. So I think it advantages Democrats. I didn't think Democrats had a chance of winning the state unless the turnout exceeded 10.5 million. At 11 million, they start getting more competitive. At 12 million, I think they probably have a slight advantage. And it looks like to me that's where we're going. Biden at least has a slight advantage.
Yeah, and I think most of the polling we've seen at the state, for example, looking at the presidential race versus the U.S. Senate race, shows that Senator Cornyn is likely to run better than President Trump in Texas by at least a few points. And so, are we going to potentially be in that zone where Biden maybe carries the state by a little bit, but not enough to pull any other statewide Democrats, Hagar or others, with him?
That's quite possible that Biden would be the ticket leader, get a higher percentage than any other Democrat. That's what Beto O'Rourke did, of course, in 2018. I think the next Democrat was about 2 points back in the AG race. But now if Biden, if there's a kind of surge here at the end and Biden bumps up to 53%, Well, that's probably going to bring in statewide Democrats, starting with, I think, with the railroad commissioner race, where you apparently have a suddenly fairly well-funded Democratic candidate with a little Mike Bloomberg cash
Right.
now. And of course, Hagar has obviously gotten part of this shower of dollars that's descended on Senate Democrats, particularly since the death of Justice Ginsburg and the quick approval of Justice Barrett. So down the stretch, Cornyn was saying a couple of days ago, what I'm really worried about is being outspent 2-1. And I think that's probably about right. Uh, and, suddenly there's this incredible rush of money into Texas that we have never seen before. And from all kinds of sources, PACs, huge spending. A guy like Bloomberg has got to love Texas, because for our state races, like the railroad commission, hell, you can give anybody directly any amount of money. There's no limitation.
Right.
And so he could write a check for what, 2.6 billion to Miss Castaneda's campaign. And that's a tough race to raise money in historically. And it usually comes from oil and gas companies. And I doubt there's any way that the Republican nominee, who beat a sitting and pretty respected commissioner, can come close to matching whatever his Democratic opponent is going to be able to spend.
Yeah, and I think sort of remarkably on the other side, what we've seen is Governor Abbott take a pretty large pool of money and spend it collectively trying to help judicial candidates statewide, Chief Justice Hecht and the other Supreme Court and Criminal Court of Appeals candidates who are on the ballot this fall, running ads about the importance of supporting Republican judges. What do you make of that spend by the governor and what it says about his and his team's thinking about the state?
Well, there are 4 of the 9 justices, and they're all Republicans up this time. So you could if they get swept, suddenly you would have a very closely divided Supreme Court. The Court of Criminal Appeals, I think 3 of 9 are up, but for political reasons, that's a much less important court than the Texas Supreme Court, which does get all these political disputes, as we've had in this cycle.
And continue to have.
But it would, the Republicans have already lost the benches in all the big urban counties except Tarrant. They have lost most of the appellate judges on the 14 courts of appeal. And they're going to lose 4 this week coming up. So the last real bastion of judicial power in the state is the Texas Supreme Court. And if there's any erosion there, this sort of turning of the state is certainly likely to be accelerated. But Abbott, I think, knows, one, I got a lot of cash, 35 or 40 million, but 2, he's looking at a very tough re-election cycle coming up that really starts a year from now, because people have to file in November 2021. And, in the last day you can file, I think, is about the 10th of December, just a little more than a year from now. He's almost certainly Abbott going to draw a significant conservative right-wing Republican opponent. I mean, the people like Alan West, the new state chair, unrelentingly critical of the governor. I don't know if Dan Patrick will jump in the race or someone else. I think Paxson is obviously pretty disqualified by his own problems, but somebody's going to run in the primary. And that's dangerous, because that primary, off-year primary for Republicans, draws about 1 million votes that are decidedly of the Tea Party's persuasion. And that's not Abbott's base of support. So I think he's trying to use his stash to strengthen himself as much as possible, first against a right-wing challenger in the primary, but then against, I think he's very worried about Beto O'Rourke deciding to make a run for governor, because a lot of his ads that he's put up for other people are paid for. Even one way or the other, trash O'Rourke as being out of step with Texas.
Right. And of course, on the other side, O'Rourke not bringing that kind of the money to the table, but has been working feverishly trying to help these Texas House candidates flip the chamber. We'll talk about that in just a second. Before that, though, a lot of congressional races at stake in Texas, perhaps more than people thought a few weeks ago. A lot of late investment from the DCCC and other entities. I think most people think probably 2 or 3 seats are likely to change hands from Republican to Democrat for Congress in Texas, but could be in a landslide, if that happens, as many as 8 or 10. What's your make of where these congressional races sit in Texas right now?
Well, I think most of the national rating services have consistently been moving them from, lean Republican to toss up to lean Democratic. it looks like the two pickup seats that Republicans were going to make a strenuous effort to recapture, the 7th and the 32nd, are probably lost now, that they have little chance of reversing based on the national spending patterns we've seen. So all the play is in 10 districts that Republicans hold. And I think minimally they're going to lose 2 or 3. Maximum, they could lose just about all of them. So it's by far the biggest congressional playing field in the country. And, you know, Republicans started this redistricting cycle in 2012 when they had drawn the districts, and they won 25 seats and the Democrats won 11. The Democrats cut that now to 13 seats that are Democratic and 23. But we could come out of this with a Democratic congressional majority for the first time since the 1990s. Wow. And that would solidify the Democrats in power in the House, I think, for likely for the rest of the decade.
And you know, what about here at home, the second congressional district? That's one where sort of rising star freshman Dan Crenshaw is the incumbent. He didn't win by all that much 2 years ago, but I think a lot of that, he's vastly outspent his opponent. But the numbers, my read of them, is they look quite close in the district so far. What do you think about the second district?
I think it may be the closest in the state. Again, Crenshaw won 53-46, again, significantly outspending his opponent. Probably the lady that's the Democratic nominee now, Sima Latavarian, is a better candidate, I would think. She's not raised as much money, but I think Trump is going to lose the district. It's a question of, can Crenshaw run far enough ahead of Trump to overcome what's increasingly becoming the urban anvil that's known as President Trump, that everybody's tossing to the Republican candidates, because Trump's popularity has just literally cratered in the cities and suburbs in the last 2.5 years.
And one of the things I've noted down the stretch is that some of the Democratic congressional campaigns are now openly tying the Republican incumbents to the president, where I think a few months ago, there was the advice was, you don't need to do that, talk about healthcare and these issues. But it suggests to me that the climate has shifted enough that they view that, you know, these are smart people who make and execute these ads and do the polling that supports them. They've concluded that this is the winning strategy, is to tie the incumbent to the unpopular president in that respective district.
Well, again, this tragedy that's happening nationally, the third wave that is clearly underway and very, very serious, is hurting the president down the stretch. So bad numbers in a lot of these districts are becoming terrible numbers. And again, that's why, like the old James Carville line, when your opponent's drowning, throw an anvil. Well, the anvil around here is Trump. And you want your opponent to catch that anvil, because, you know, he's going down. And the New York Times Siena College poll, I think, looked at the 12 most competitive congressional districts, and Trump was losing them collectively. I think he was ahead in 2 or 3, but collectively, and, you know, those are high turnout, normally Republican advantage districts, but there are a dozen of them. That's a big chunk of the whole state electorate.
And let's shift to the Texas House of Representatives, which has been a big focus of the campaign here in the state over the longer term of this cycle. And now some bigger factors have sort of come in late. But, you know, Democrats, of course, need 9 seats net to win control of the chamber. There are upwards, I think, of 20 seats that are Republican held that are thought to be potentially competitive. As you mentioned, we've had outsized voter participation in a lot of these suburban counties like Collin County, Denton County, Tarrant, at Fort Bend, where a lot of these seats are located. What's your sense of the battle for control of the House?
I think it's game on. You know, a lot of people thought, well, 9 seats are too much to make up, but, you know, Democrats had a big deficit in the Virginia House of Delegates, or whatever they call the second house there. They were down 2-1. Then all of a sudden they caught up, and now in 2 election cycles, they've become the governing party in the legislature. Democrats gained a dozen of the House seats. That, you know, more than half the Republican advantage that they had after the 2016 election. But this trend that led to, you know, a dozen wins and 3 or 4 really close losses, as in my view, continued. So I think the Democrats minimally win 6-7 seats, which makes the House extremely close. But more, I'm putting the Democratic net gain in the 10 to 12 seat range, and they could get hot like in Virginia and win 15.
Yeah, a lot of fascinating turns of events. I mean, again, I think my sense is that because there's so many new voters showing up in a lot of these suburban districts around the state, it's hard to get your finger on exactly what's going on, right? We
Yeah.
don't know exactly who these folks are. We can make some, you know, suppositions about it, but it's not clear until you see what the tally is.
I've got to think that most of these House candidates are virtually unknown, even if they're an incumbent. So I think it's Trump that's driving this huge surge of voting in the suburban counties and the suburban districts. And I think it's going to be really hard for individual candidates to separate themselves from the performance of their presidential nominee. And since those are the districts that have most shifted against Trump, that puts Republicans at a real risk of not just losing, but losing pretty badly their House majority in Austin.
Well, we're going to have it'd be fascinating to see what happens on Tuesday night. Uh, I want to cover one more subject, but before I do, I want to remind folks that if you have a question you'd like answered, if you can submit it in the chat. We talked about CD2, which was one of the one question we'd had submitted earlier. But if you have others, we're happy to try to address them to the extent we can. The last subject I want to talk about comes back to this idea of litigation and is focused on Harris County. As we've seen, over the last several weeks, there have been a number of attempts to uh, curtail expanded access to mail ballots and, thwarting the desire to send every voter in Harris County a mail ballot, as the county clerk here wanted to do. But we've now seen, I think, 3 suits filed about this drive-through voting that's been going on in Harris County throughout early vote, which seems to be pretty popular. A little less than 10% of all early voters have taken advantage of drive-through voting, about 125,000 people. We had 2 suits by Dr. Hotze and some of his cohorts asking the Supreme Court to stop drive-through voting in Harris County. They declined to do so twice. There was a new suit filed several days ago, essentially asking to invalidate all votes cast by drive-through voting because they were a violation of the Constitution and other things. I'm not an attorney, so I won't try to explain the details of that. We saw word earlier today that the Supreme Court has asked Harris County to respond to this, uh, suit from Hotze and others by 4 p.m. this afternoon. Um, what do you make of this? I mean, do you think the Supreme Court's going to throw out 120,000 votes in Harris County? Many of whom are Republicans, by the way.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. I think a big question would be if you could throw them out. Would it make any difference? Sometimes the margins are so that the point is moot because even if you remove them, it's not going to change the result. That's a possibility. If you throw them out, what in the hell do you do with those 120,000 people that were, thought they were following the rules and find their votes not counted for anything? President, county commissioner, whatever. You have a lot of options in the courts. I mean, you can actually, have uh, a whole new election over. That's unlikely, but every now and then we've done that after an election dispute. You could perhaps hold some kind of special, revote that persons that ballots were identified as drive-throughs and were thrown out could revote after the election is over on the 3rd. All kinds of possibilities. But remember, the Supreme Court is themselves on the ballot, and they kind of split the difference. But I find one of the most important decisions was one that some Republicans tried to get reversed, and that was Governor Abbott's extension of 6 additional days to start early voting on the 13th of October. That has, to me, been enormously consequential. 3 million or so people took advantage of those extra 6 days. It meant that the lines were not nearly as long in most counties, and it helped contribute to this terrific turnout. And that was a Republican governor who ordered that, sued by some other Republicans, but the Supreme Court said, no, let it go. So that's that's irreversible, of course. I mean, 3 million votes, you can't throw out 3 million votes. And I think that was perhaps the single most important election rule decision that the governor, who didn't want to open up the big counties to everybody getting an absentee ballot app, instead sort of tried to split the difference and true Greg Abbott style and say, well, I'm going to turn you down on this. So Harris County, you can't mail out 2.4 million apps, but you get 6 extra days of early voting. And people voted in droves.
Yeah, and I wonder if there's, what if the Supreme Court, for example, decides to invalidate those drive-through votes on Monday, and then says, if you voted drive-through, you can go back on Tuesday and vote in person if you want. The county has a record, obviously, of everybody that voted that way. Does that strike you as a plausible scenario?
Possible, but risky for the court. They're on the ballot the next day. A hell of a lot of people that may have thought they were going to vote for them might decide, you forced me to go back to the polls in the middle of this pandemic and probably in long lines in a lot of places. If their elections are close, they could actually lose, not only because I think this would be very upsetting to the 100,000+ people who use that option, but I think every newspaper in the state is likely to wade in the morning of election day and talk about what a lousy decision the court just made. So at the end of the day, they're pretty political animals over there. They have to run in partisan elections, unlike many judges around the country. So yeah, they could do it, but they're putting their own political futures at great risk to, at the last minute, disqualify 100,000+ people and say, oh, and you got 12 hours, you can vote the next day. So,
yeah. Well, we'll have to see how that shakes out. Question we have here: the polls in 2016 failed to capture the shy Trump voter. How does the shy Trump and shy Biden voter impact the 2020 polls?
Well, the polls actually were pretty close to spot on. Nationally, Clinton had about a 3-point advantage. She finished with 2. There wasn't a hell of a lot of quality polling in the swing states that Trump, surged at the end and won. I don't think it was shy Trump voters that were turning down interviews. I think what we know, particularly from the exit polls, is just about 75% of the late deciders went to Trump. Well, that's unpollable. I mean, they didn't decide many of the case until election day. And that's where Trump really opened up this surprising advantage. But again, there weren't many polls in the states like Michigan or Wisconsin. And when we did the exit polls on election day, Trump decidedly won the very late deciders. But that was just a totally different election with 2 opponents that were both widely disliked. And that's not the case in 2020.
Yeah, and I think, one of the other often discussed points from after 2016 was the underrepresentation of non-college educated white voters, particularly in the upper Midwest and a lot of the state level polling that went on. I think pollsters have gone to great lengths this cycle to correct for that factor. And we've certainly seen no shortage of polling from those battleground states over the last few months. So I agree with you. I tend to think that aspect of things is not likely to be a risk. Someone asked, what do you think Biden's margin of victory would need to be for the president, if Biden were to win, for the president not to contest the results of the election?
Well, I think it would mean that you'd need to win by at least 3 or 4 states that even if 2 or 3 were flipped, it still wouldn't change the electoral college result. And that's the popular vote's interesting, but if you're going to reverse the election, you have to reverse the count in the 538 electoral votes that are out there. And if it's more than 1 or 2 states, that's really hard to see how in the hell you could push this through. Maybe in 1876, back after the first election after the Reconstruction, I think there were 3 states that were hung up, and they had 2 different sets of electors, and the Supreme Court stayed out of it, which was the usual way back then, but Congress had to wade in. But I don't think you've had a multi-state contest in a controversial election since 1876, and that's been quite a while. So my sense is the margins are going to be substantial enough that even though the president might emotionally want to make a big stink and turn loose his lawyers, that cooler heads would prevail, particularly if you've got the Senate's fate riding on what in the hell happens in Georgia after the election, because of the likelihood that those voters are going to have to go back to the polls. And if it looks like Republicans are trying to reverse a popular vote decision in a state that's now 50-50, they can lose a couple of Senate seats.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up there for this, final pre-election installment. It's been an interesting discussion in advance, and I suspect we'll try to reconvene next Friday and see what the hell happened. I don't. We have thoughts on that, but we're not going to. Nobody's actually going to know until Tuesday evening. So, with
And
that,
I think we'll have a pretty good idea Tuesday evening. Both Florida and Texas are pretty early vote report states. Uh, we're going to have 10 million votes cast by absentee, and Texas allows the bigger counties to start processing those votes. You don't have a stupid rule like Pennsylvania that you can't touch the ballot until the morning of election day. So we'll get most of those absentee votes tallied quickly, and we'll get, of course, virtually all of the in-person early votes were recorded electronically, and those can be almost instantly counted. So, and usually you don't have certainly a decided advantage in the election day vote. We do say it usually leans a bit more Democratic, but if you've got 10 million votes in and somebody has a big substantial advantage, counting on that election day vote to reverse, that's not likely to happen.
yeah, agreed. I think we'll see, rough upwards of 80% of our vote in Texas will be in as of early vote in mail ballots. So we may have a number of close races. I actually think that's quite possible for statewide congressional and legislative races. We may see some very close contests there, but if they're not close, any contests that aren't close after early vote, they're unlikely to become so, it seems to me, based on election day voting. Well, all right. Thank you, Dad, as always. And thanks everyone for joining us. And we'll see you next week after this is all said and done. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.